Hello everyone and welcome back to another kanji video. Today we're going to be learning how you can go ahead and learn more kanji than 99% of people. That might sound like a bold claim, but I promise you that many people are learning kanji in a very basic way, and at least that's what was true for me. And today I want to go ahead and show you a really cool method which will help you learn kanji faster. And I'm a big believer in learning by doing, so if you've been following along with the series, we're going to be learning some more brand new kanji today, which are part of the kind of common kanji. So these are kanji you will encounter in daily life if you're planning to go to Japan, or if you're just wanting to get better at reading in Japanese, then these are going to be really useful. So of course, as always, the slides are in the description, so if you want to revise afterwards using the slides, then please feel free to use those. And also, just before we jump into it today, don't forget that we do have this 90-day 1000 kanji challenge. So if you enjoy the techniques and methods that we're going to be learning inside this video, and you want a complete guide which walks you through all 1000 of the most common kanji, so JLT M5 all the way to N2, then please feel free to check that out, top link in the description. We also cover vocabulary and things like that, and other important aspects of learning Japanese. But apart from that, we'll go ahead and jump into the first kanji here, which is past or leave. So you might be wondering how we can go ahead and memorize this kanji. But before we do that, let's go ahead and have a look at some example words so you can get a better understanding to how it's used in context. This is really important because when I was starting to learn Japanese, I used to just learn the kanji and I wouldn't learn any of the associated words with it. Even if you don't necessarily memorize the words associated with it, just getting more of an understanding of how the kanji is used in context can be really powerful to leveling up your understanding of each of these kanji. So you can see how when combined with this kanji on the right here, which means year, so it literally means past year, or you could also maybe think of it as the leaving year. So the top part of this kanji here actually means soil, and this is a kanji on its own, but this is a kanji which is being used as something we call a radical in Japanese. A radical is a component of a more complex kanji. So this soil kanji here is actually being used as a radical for the top of this leave kanji. You could also think of it as it's how, like, since it's quite a cross shape, you could think of it as like a cross-shaped gravestone, well, it's a little bit darker, on top of soil. And the reason why I think that can work quite well is because a gravestone can be quite associated with soil because it's a grave. So that could be a good way to remember it if you're struggling, but whatever kind of memory technique you need to try and remember these kanji can be really powerful. Another benefit as well for coming for a more sad or dark meaning is because it has a little bit more of an emotion tied to it. And usually the more emotion we can incorporate when remembering these different kanji, the easier it's going to stick. Then we've got this second component of this kanji, which means private. If you've learned any katakana in Japanese, which a lot of you probably will have if you're learning kanji now, you will be familiar that this looks a lot like the katakana symbol for mu. So how I like to remember this is I like to think of a cow. Why a cow? Because cows go moo, and it's just typing in a password or something like that onto a computer. And the reason why I think of that is because password is like something you associate with private or privacy. And you will notice that a few of these katakana characters in Japanese look a lot like some of the simpler kanji and kanji radicals. And yeah, as I mentioned, I just like to think of this as a cow typing their password into a computer because it looks like the katakana mu. And when I think of mu, I think of like a cow because that's the noise cows make. And yeah, that's how I like to remember it. So let's go ahead and try put this kanji together now. So we know that this top part here means soil, and we know that this bottom part here means private. So how can we go ahead and put those two together to come up with the meaning for leave to try and remember that? Well, how I like to think of it is I imagine this kind of memory box. If you were in school, sometimes they talk about these things called memory boxes, which is where you put some precious items or some private items in there, and you go ahead and you bury it in the ground for maybe someone in the future to find. So how I like to think of it is it's just a precious memory box being buried in the soil to be left behind. Now, the reason why I say left is because the meaning of the kanji is leave, or it can mean gone or kind of past. So I like to think of it as like a private thing. Why private? Because the bottom component is private and it's being left behind in the soil. Why left behind? Because the meaning of the kanji is leave. And why in the soil? Because the top part of the kanji here means soil. So let's go ahead and now take a break for some memory techniques here and just go ahead and practice writing out the kanji. If you're a beginner in learning kanji, this can be really beneficial, as a lot of people are skipping writing today because it's not really used as much in modern Japanese because of the existence of keyboards and typing. But to be honest, I really think that writing is one of the most powerful things which I've done to really enhance my memory, as you can also build a good bit of muscle memory as well to really enhance your memory alongside these memory techniques. So this is definitely something I would highly recommend, but of course if you do want to skip it, you can just go ahead and maybe try and visualize the kanji instead or something like that. And if you want to practice writing, you can either use a pen and paper, or you can go to the link in the description to clayki.com, which will take you to this website here, where you can go ahead and you can practice drawing on your keyboard just with your mouse, or you can also use it on mobile as well, which is pretty cool. If you're watching this on mobile, you might not want to be flipping between tabs while watching this video. So what you could do instead, if you want to practice the writing, is just after this video, you can go ahead and open the slides in the description below and just follow along afterwards. So once you've gone ahead and written that out a few times, then we'll go ahead and move on to the next page here, where we're going to try and write out from memory. So make sure to either turn your paper over if you're using pen and paper, so you can't see what you've just written, or if you're working with clayki.com, all you can do here is come to the top right hand corner and you can see there's this little white paper thing, which if I hover my mouse over it, it just says new. And if I press that, it's going to come up with a page and just ask me to create a new image. And I can just press OK. And I've got a blank piece of paper again. So hopefully you got an OK with that. And now we'll go ahead and move on to the next kanji, which is law or method. Now this one here you can see is using that kanji we were just learning. And if you remember, when we use a kanji inside of a more complex kanji, we call it a radical or component. So this kanji for leave here is being used as a component or radical for this more complex kanji, meaning law or method. So you might then be wondering, what does this bit on the left mean? And this actually means water. So we'll go ahead and cover how we can memorize that using a memory technique in a minute. But for now, let's have a look at some of the common words which this kanji uses so we can better understand how it's used in context. So this means law or method. So when we combine it with this first kanji here, which means sentence or literature, we get bunpo, meaning grammar. So that kind of makes sense because it's literally a literature rule or literature law. So literally literature law means grammar. Then on the right here, when we combine it with the kanji for create, we get saho, which means manners. So you could almost think of it as how it's like a created method or created law that humans have made in order to be polite to each other or something like that. Then we have this radical here, which means water. And I think this looks a lot like a smiley face. You can see how these two bits look like eyes, and this bit looks like a mouth. So I just like to think of this as a smiley face made out of water, and that's how I've always remembered it personally. Then we've got this part here, which of course means past or leave, which if you remember, we just remembered as how someone puts a precious box into the soil and leaves it. So the reason why they're leaving it is because, of course, the meaning of this kanji is leave. The reason why it's a precious memory box or a private memory box is because the bottom component of this kanji here, or well, it's been used as a radical in this case, is meaning private. And then why in the soil? Because this top part here actually means soil. And when we put that all together, I came up with this meaning of a person leaving a private memory box in the soil. So putting it all together, we now have water and leave. So how I like to think of this, and those of you who are following along with the last video will remember this analogy, hopefully, and that's that we like to think of making tea. So if you're from the UK, you'll be familiar with the process. I don't know how popular making tea is in America, but essentially when we make tea, we first of all boil the water, and then we want to go ahead and put the tea bag in the water. Now, if we put the tea bag in the water and take it out straight away, then we're not really going to have much tea. We're just going to have kind of flavored water, which isn't very nice and not as nutritious as letting the tea soak. So what we want to do instead is we want to put the tea bag in the water and then leave it for a bit. So this worked quite nicely for the kanji's meaning here because it's water and then leave. So we're putting the tea bag in the water and then we're leaving it. And I just like to think of it as how you leave the tea bag to make the water, and that's the method of making tea. And the reason why I'm emphasizing method here is because, of course, the meaning of this kanji is method or law. So the law of making tea is to leave the tea bag in the water to let the nutrients soak in. So that's how I like to remember it personally. But of course, if you're coming up with any of your own memorable analogies which help you remember this, make sure to use them, because usually the most intuitive thing that comes to your brain will stick the best. And by coming up with your own memorable analogies, that's a great way to give yourself a little bit of an edge in remembering these kanji. Now let's go ahead and pause the video and practice writing it out. And we're following the usual kakijun pattern, kakijun just meaning stroke order, which is the order in which we write out this kanji, which is quite useful for keeping the kanji nice and neat. And you'll notice that we work one component at a time here. So we start off with the water component, so the smiley face made out of water. And then we're working with the gone component or leave component, which remember the top part here is soil and then the bottom part here is private. So we just like to think of it as like a private box being left in the soil. And when put all together, we get the kanji for law or method. And now, once you've gone ahead and practiced that a few times, feel free to pause the video, turn over your piece of paper or create a blank piece of paper on Clicky, and we can go ahead and we can try write it out from memory. So best of luck with that. Then we'll go ahead and move on to the next one, which is life. So a bit of a different kanji here, just to mix up a little bit. And you can see this one's got a couple of example words here. First of all, we've got ikiru, which is just to live. And then we've also got gakusei, which just means student. So if you've done any kanji before, you will notice that this kanji here looks quite similar to the kanji for king. It's just these 3 lines. But the difference is life, of course, has this little dash at the top. And also the middle stroke comes up a little bit higher. We can actually use this to try and remember this kanji. So I like to think of it as how it's a king being born. The reason why is because being born is quite associated with the idea of life. And also the meaning of this kanji, while it does mean life, it can also mean born or birth as well. So that's a great way to learn both the associated meanings with this kanji. And also this is a great way to learn the kanji for king at the same time if you weren't previously familiar with it, as now you're learning 2 kanji at the same time instead of just 1. Just remember that the kanji for life will have that extra stroke on top here. Alright, now let's go ahead and practice writing it out. So feel free to pause the video and practice writing it out again. And again, that's really going to help you build that muscle memory. And when you combine that with these memory techniques, you build a really solid memory for each of these kanji. So feel free to practice writing that out a few times with Clicky or pen and paper. Then we'll go ahead and we'll now try it from memory. So feel free to create a blank piece of paper on Clicky, or you can just turn over your page using normal pen and paper. Or if you're just following along without doing any writing, then you can just try and recall it in your head and try and visualize it in your head to try and remember it. Or you can even try write it out in the sky like this. I was about to spoil it there. But yeah, that's a few different strategies you can use to try and remember it. That will try and trigger that active recall, which is really good if you want to set yourself ahead from most people, as a lot of people will sometimes just read kanji and they won't actually try and recall it from memory. And the reason for that, I think, is because it is a little bit uncomfortable to try and recall something from memory. But the benefit of doing it is that it helps strengthen up the memory, so next time you can have a lot more comfort when remembering the kanji. Now let's go ahead and move on to the next kanji here, which is tongue. And this is made up of 2 radicals, which we're going to be covering in a minute. And on its own, it just means shita, which is tongue. And then I've also got this word here, which is shitauchi, which is just clicking one's tongue. So this kanji here kind of means like strike or hit. So it's almost like hitting one's tongue. So the top part of this kanji, as you can see here, is 1000. And you can see it looks a little bit like a sign, like a wooden sign. And this is how I like to think of it. It's like a wooden sign, and maybe it says like Japan 1,000 miles or something 1,000 miles, some kind of road sign. And the reason why I say 1,000 miles is because, of course, this kanji means 1,000. And yes, as I mentioned, this is a kanji, so you can use this on its own. But in this case, it's being used as a radical of a more complex kanji. But on its own, it can be used too. The reason why I'm clarifying that is because there are some radicals which can't be used on their own as kanji. But these are usually very simple radicals, so it's quite obvious that they maybe wouldn't be used as kanji. If you remember that 90-day kanji challenge I mentioned at the start of the video, we cover both the kanji which can be used on their own and as radicals inside of more complex kanji, as well as the radicals which aren't really used on their own as kanji, but they are very prevalent in a lot of common kanji. For this kanji, I just like to think of a crooked road sign saying 1,000 miles on it. And next up, we've got this component here, which means mouth, which is the bottom of this kanji. And this kind of makes sense since a tongue is quite associated with the mouth. And you can see this almost looks a bit like an open mouth. And that's how I like to remember it. If you've been learning any katakana, you'll also notice it looks a lot like the katakana ro symbol. So you could think of it as how maybe it's just a person shouting ro or something like that at the top of their lungs, right? So that's one way you could remember it. This is the invented meaning, which I came up with for this kanji. I just like to think of it as a person sticking their tongue out, shouting 1,000. So it's really silly, but the thing is, because it's so silly, it's probably going to stick in your mind more. So yeah, that's how I like to remember it. And if you want to try and get more of that physical learning, you could go ahead and do that yourself to help yourself remember it. Because again, by doing some kind of physical action, that's a great way to try and trigger more emotion and more memory in your brain. So that's another strategy you can do to try and improve the effectiveness of these memory techniques, is to act them out in some way. But if you don't want to act it out, just making sure that you try and invoke loads of emotion with the invented meaning can be really useful. So maybe like for this one, for example, the person shouting 1,000 with their tongue sticking out, just in your brain really visualize that shouting and maybe like the whole building is shaking as they're shouting or something like that. Or maybe like loads of tongues start falling from the sky since the meaning of the kanji is tongue. Just anything crazy and really wacky to try and help you remember it, because the more wacky and emotionally engaging you make these memorable analogies, the easier time you're going to have having them stick in your brain. So that can be a really great strategy there, and I hope that helps. So now let's go ahead and pause the video and practice writing out a few times. So feel free to open up Clayki again, or you can go ahead and you can just get pen and paper and you can practice writing this out a few times. Then once you're done, we'll go ahead and we'll then try it from memory. So best of luck, and I hope you found that okay. And remember, if you're not following along with the writing, you can maybe try to draw it with your finger in air. Or if you're maybe watching this video while you're eating dinner, as some people do for Japanese lessons, then you can maybe just try visualizing it in your head instead. Next up, we have this kanji here, which means life or activity. And you can see we're using a couple of components we've already learned today, which is pretty cool. On the left here, we've got this component for water. And on the right here, we have this kanji for tongue, but it's now being used as a radical inside of this more complex kanji. And together, this means kind of life or activity. So slightly different meaning from the kanji we were learning earlier, which is more like life or birth. This has more of a kind of activity meaning to it. So when we combine it with that other kanji, which also means life, we get seikatsu, which means life or livelihood. So it's almost like life activity or life liveliness to kind of mean life or livelihood, right? And then we've also got this word here, which is katsudo, which is being combined with this kanji here for movement to make activity. So it's like an active movement is an activity. So having a look at this radical here, first of all, we got the radical for water, which I think looks a lot like a smiley face. So again, I just like to think of this as it's a smiley face made out of water. Then we've got this component here, which means tongue. This is broken into two radicals. The top part here, which kind of looks a bit like a crooked sign, is meaning 1,000. And then the bit underneath means mouth, which almost looks like an open mouth. So for the top part, it just means 1,000. And I like to just think of that as like a crooked road sign, which says 1,000 miles on it. And that's how I like to remember it. And then the bottom component is mouth, which makes sense since tongue is quite associated with mouth. And I just like to think of that as an open mouth. And again, just to recap, we like to think of this kanji as like a person sticking their tongue out shouting 1,000. But of course, you can come up with your own memorable analogy if something more intuitive is coming to your mind. And again, we really want to exaggerate that shouting aspect just to really exaggerate the memory technique and really help you remember this more effectively. So putting it all together, here's the invented meaning which I came up with for this kanji. I just like to think of it as how if your tongue is wet, you're well hydrated and full of life. So you know that feeling when you just haven't drunk water in ages and you just feel dead and tired and it's just horrible. Whereas on the other hand, when you're well hydrated, you're full of energy and you're ready to go ahead and tackle the day. So that's how I like to think of it, is how when your tongue is wet is a sign that you're hydrated and full of life. And the reason why we're using hydrated and tongue is because hydrated is associated with water. And of course, the first component here is water. And then why tongue? Because of course, the second component here is tongue. And why active and full of life? Because the meaning of this kanji is life/activity. So now let's go ahead and practice writing this one out. So feel free to pause the video and you can go ahead and practice writing this one out. Again, we're working one component at a time. So we start off with the water component, then we'll work with the 1,000 component and then the tongue component to create that kanji. And once you've done that, feel free to go ahead and practice writing it from memory, or you can just visualize it in your head if you're not following along with the writing. And make sure you do that on a blank piece of paper so you don't see your previous written answer. And finally, we're going to be finishing off with a little bit more of a scary looking kanji, but I promise you it's not too difficult. It's made up of a few components which are fairly easy to understand. So first of all, you'll see that we have that component for tongue. And on the right here, we have this kanji being used as a radical, which looks very similar to the kanji for eye if you've been following along with any of these videos. But this time it has a dot on top, which means it isn't actually meaning I now. It's actually meaning oneself or self. So I like to think of this as almost like looking within oneself, like the eye of the self or something like that. And then underneath we have this radical here, which means heart. And you'll see how I remember this kanji in a minute. So let's have a look at some example words first, just so we can understand the context of how this kanji is used. So of course it means rest. And when we combine it with this kanji here, which actually also means rest, we get kyukei, which just means break or rest. We've also got ikoi, which is another way of saying rest. And as I mentioned, we've got this first component here, which means tongue, which I like to just think of as a person shouting 1,000 with their tongue sticking out. Why 1,000? Because this top part here, so these two lines and the line in the middle, make the radical for 1000. And why shouting? Because shouting is quite associated with having an open mouth, and this radical component at the bottom here actually means mouth. Feel free to exaggerate this in your mind as much as possible. Maybe imagine the building shaking as they're shouting, or tongues falling from the sky as they're shouting. And that will really help you remember this analogy. Then we've got this component here, which means oneself. And if you take away this dot, it becomes the kanji for I. But when we add this dot, it becomes oneself. Something to keep in mind about this kanji is it looks very similar to of course, the kanji for I, but it also looks very similar to the kanji for white as well. The difference being it just has an extra line. Then we've got this kanji here, which is heart, which is being used as a radical inside of this kanji for rest. And when it's drawn normally, you can see it has these 3 dashes and this sort of L shape in the middle. How I like to remember this is if you have a look at a heart shape, it kind of looks like an L. At least it always has to me since I've been young. So I've just rotated this heart so it kind of looks more like an L. And then I've got these 3 kind of shock waves, which is supposed to be kind of like the ba-dump kind of sound effect of the heart. Now, one thing to keep in mind about this kanji is it doesn't really refer to a physical heart, although it is used in the word for a physical heart. Its main meaning on its own is more like feeling heart, like my heart is telling me this kind of heart. And it can also kind of mean spirit and mind in that sort of sense as well. So when we combine all these together, we get tongue, we get oneself, and we get heart to mean rest. So now we need to think about how we can put all of these together in order to remember this kanji. So how I like to think of it is your tongue is exhausted from eating too much ice cream, so you rest. So why tongue? Because of course the first component here is tongue, and then why yourself? Because this component here means oneself. And then we can use this heart part here to try think of this kind of exhaustion of the spirit almost, right? Because after eating loads of ice cream, more than anything, you're just feeling very spiritually drained, maybe. So that could be one way of associating that kind of heart meaning in there as well. And this is, of course, a bit more of a complex one. So you may need to add a couple of your own analogies in there to try and help strengthen this one up. But this is a meaning which sticks pretty well for me. So hopefully it sticks pretty well for you as well. And of course, the important aspect here is to remember rest as well, because that is the meaning of the kanji. So that's why I've made sure to make this person look really tired in this image here, so it really helps you associate that meaning. Now let's go ahead and practice writing this one out, and this does look very intimidating, but keep in mind if we break it down into simple components, it's not actually too bad. So we just start off by drawing out the kanji for tongue, then we draw out the kanji for oneself, and then we finish off with the kanji being used as a radical for heart. And when we've done that all together, we'll get the kanji for rest. So feel free to pause the video and practice writing that out a few times, and then we could go ahead and we can try it from memory. So best of luck, and I hope you get on okay with that. All right, awesome. And also guys, just a quick reminder that if you're enjoying these kind of videos, if you like learning kanji like this, and maybe you just want to learn all the 1000 most common kanji, so JLPT N5 up to N2, just to get it out of the way, then feel free to check out my 1000 kanji 90-day challenge, so you can go ahead and learn the most common kanji and make it a strength in your Japanese learning game rather than a weakness. And of course, we also cover loads about vocabulary and other important parts of learning Japanese as well. So while you will be learning the 1000 common kanji, you'll also be learning a bunch of other stuff as well inside of that learning community. So feel free to check that out if that interests you. And apart from that, I would just like to thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day. Feel free to let me know what you thought of this video and if you have any feedback or suggestions, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video. Take care.